grabs him and takes his shotgun and puts it right up against his throat and says, you know, who are you? Okay? Well, Brewer identified himself. Investigator Hawkins asked Brewer if the man was still in the theater, and Brewer acknowledged that the man was still in the theater, in which approximately 16 people were seated. There were only 16 people watching this movie at the time. Well, Dallas police officer M.N. McDonald asked Brewer to point Oswald out to him, and Brewer pointed Oswald out from the front of the stage. While the movie's playing, he walks out by the screen and goes, there he is right back there, points him out in the back. Well, Oswald was sitting in the rear of the theater in the center aisle. In other words, there was rows on this side, and there was a space, rows in the middle, and a space and rows on this side, if you can picture that. And he was in the center aisle, and he was 3 rows from the back, sitting in the 5th seat from the aisle. So he's in the center row, 3 from the back, 5 seats in. Well, Officer Hawkins walks up the right side of the theater aisle. Officer McDonald walks the left side, followed by other officers. And McDonald approaches Oswald from the left side of the theater. Well, after watching the police officers approach him, Oswald stood up and started to exit the row. He was going to try to get out of there, and seeing there was no escape, he actually sits in the 2nd seat then. So he moves from the 5th seat over to the 2nd seat, and he's sitting there. Well, at 1:50 p.m., Officer M.N. McDonald approaches Oswald and asks him to stand up. Oswald stands up and he blurts out, quote, "Well, it's all over now." And he stands up and punches Officer McDonald in the face while reaching for his .38 caliber revolver that he had hidden in his waistband. And as Oswald points and fires his pistol at McDonald, the officer grabs his gun. Now, I'm going to have Mackenzie point her fake pistol at me. And here's the hammer of the pistol, and he grabs the gun, and he just so happens to grab it so when the hammer comes down, it hits right between his thumb and his first finger and keeps the gun from going off. Otherwise, he's this far away from him, shoots him right in the stomach probably, or worse. Well, after this goes about, Paul Bentley, one of the 4 officers I mentioned, reached back and punched Oswald as hard as he could right in the head. And Oswald was subdued. As he left the theater, he kept yelling, "I am not resisting arrest. I am not resisting arrest." Seemed like he probably was resisting arrest. But that's the first indication of how weird it's going to get from Oswald from this point on when they start interrogating him and some of the things he does and says. Well, Oswald was handcuffed by Sergeant Gerald Hill and taken from the theater to a waiting police car that would take him to police headquarters in downtown Dallas. Now, if you pull these affidavits out, you can probably get these online now, but I got these a long time ago. And these are affidavits that were spoken and then typed by the County of Dallas as a sworn statement, and each of these people signed them. I won't read them all, but here's one from Helen Markham. She says, at approximately 1:06 p.m. November 22nd, 1963, I was standing on the corner of East 10th and Patton Street waiting for traffic to go by when I saw a squad car stop in front of 404 East 10th Street about 50 feet from where I was standing. I saw a young white man walk up to the squad car opposite the driver's side, lean over and put his arms on the door of the car for a few seconds, then straighten up and step back from the car 2 or 3 feet. At this point, the officer got out of the squad car and started around in front of the car. And just as he got even with the left front wheel, this young white man shot the officer, and the officer fell to the pavement. I screamed, and the man ran west on East 10th Street across Patton Street and went out of sight. That was her original testimony from that time. If you look at the next page, in the back, you're going to see Ted Calloway's. He said, I was the manager of the used car lot at 501 East Jefferson. I was working today when I heard some shots. This was about 1 p.m. I ran out into Patton Street and looked to see what the shooting was about. I saw a white man running south on Patton with a pistol in hand. I hollered at him and he looked around at me, then kept on going. I ran around on 10th Street and saw a police officer lying in the street. He looked dead to me. I got the officer's gun and hollered at a cab driver to come on. We might catch the man. We got into his cab, number 213, and drove up Patton to Jefferson and looked all around but did not see him. The number 2 man in the lineup that I saw at City Hall is the man I saw with the gun in his hand. And we'll get to that later, because Oswald's going to get arrested and put into lineups. But that's pretty good story. I'll let you read Officer Nick McDonald's statement and Julia Postal's on your own, but they are the original statements from those individuals shortly after that. Now, a couple things I want to tell you about this boarding house that Oswald was staying at, and we'll get into that a little more later. He stayed at the boarding house for 6 weeks. He was paying $8 a week. There were 18 total rooms in the boarding house, ranging in price from $8 a week to $24 a week, and it was a 5 to 8 minute ride for Oswald daily from the boarding house to the school book depository when he took the bus. It took him about 8 minutes to get there, and we'll show you some of that stuff here in a bit. You might wonder where in the world was his wife. Well, she was living with another lady at the time because they were having some marital troubles. Okay? All right, well, let's talk about events back at Parkland Hospital, right? We talked about the president being pronounced dead. What happened after that? Well, since President Kennedy was killed in Dallas, Texas state law required the president's autopsy be done in Dallas by civilian doctors. And as a result, Dallas medical examiner Dr. Earl Rose insisted that the autopsy be done in Dallas. Well, the Kennedy camp had different viewpoints on that. They planned to take the president's body from Parkland Hospital back to Washington, D.C. And the man who insisted that the president's body be taken back was Roy Kellerman. He was one of the 2 Secret Service agents in the presidential limousine. He was the head of presidential detail in Dallas, and he made no bones about it that he was getting the president back to D.C. Now, despite the fact he would be breaking Texas state law, Kellerman was insistent for 3 reasons. Okay, now, did I tell you that last time? Why he was so insistent? Why do you think he wanted to get the president's body back? Why didn't he want the autopsy to be done there by Texas state law?
Well, one of the things I think he said is that he knew that Jackie Kennedy wouldn't leave until the
Absolutely.
body, she'd stay with the body.
Well, first of all, and that's right, but his first thought is he strongly believed that Vice President Johnson had to get out of Washington, D.C. for security reasons. He knew Johnson wasn't going back without Mrs. Kennedy, and he knew Mrs. Kennedy was not going back without the president's body. And so Kellerman made no bones that we're getting out of here. So again, Kellerman strongly believed that Vice President Johnson must be taken back for security reasons. Vice President Johnson refused to leave Dallas without Mrs. Kennedy, and Mrs. Kennedy refused to leave Dallas without her husband's body. Now, Dr. Rose was later quoted as saying, this got really ugly, this is what he said about this incident. He said, "I was in their way. I was face to face with Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, and I was trying to explain to him that Texas law applied in the instant case of the death of the president, and that the law required an autopsy to be performed in Texas. No one was in charge of the situation. Agent Kellerman tried 3 tactics to have his way. He asserted his identity as representing the Secret Service, he appealed for sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy, and he used body language in an attempt to bully, or should I say intimidate. At no time did I feel I was in physical danger because he and the others were armed. I was not looking at Agent Kellerman's gun, I was looking at his eyes, and they were very tense. His eyes said he meant to get the president's body back to Washington." Well, this disagreement between Agent Kellerman and Dr. Rose led to a heated discussion. There was incredibly bad swearing, even the pulling of guns by both Dallas police and Secret Service agents. And the entire mess was all witnessed by Mrs. Kennedy. To settle the heated discussion, Kenneth O'Donnell steps up to the plate and he makes a proposal. He proposes that Admiral George G. Berkeley, the president's personal physician who was on the trip, would stay with the president's body until the autopsy back in Washington. That was the compromise he was trying to come up with. Well, when both sides agreed to the proposal, O'Donnell asked Agent Clint Hill to obtain a casket for the president. Well, Agent Hill called a local mortuary and asked them to deliver the best casket they had to Parkland Hospital immediately. Once assured the president's body was being taken back to Love Field, Vice President Johnson then departed under the protection of Secret Service to Air Force One. Later, the president's body was placed in the casket, And despite O'Donnell's proposal, controversy continued as the president's body was forcibly taken from the hospital. So it never was agreed upon that he would go. They took it by force. At 2:08 p.m., the casket was loaded into a hearse outside Parkland Hospital, and they departed for Love Field. The hearse carrying the president's body arrived at Love Field at 2:14 p.m., and the next decision would be where they were going to place the president's body on Air Force One for the trip back to Washington, D.C. And to be honest with you, the Secret Service had already made the decision that the president's body is not going to fly below like a piece of luggage. They already made that decision. Well, as a result, prior to the hearse arriving at Love Field, 2 rows of seats had been taken out of Air Force One to make room for the president's coffin. Upon arrival at Love Field, the president's casket was loaded onto Air Force One, and it was very, very heavy, and it was too wide to fit through the doors of Air Force One, so the Secret Service had to break off the handles trying to get the casket through the doors to board the aircraft. It wouldn't fit with the handles on. Now, according to Sergeant John Hames, who served as a flight steward aboard Air Force One, I remember they broke off one of the handles trying to get the casket through the rear door of the Boeing 707. I put the broken handle with the casket when they took it off at the airport in Washington after we arrived. The next issue arose when the casket wouldn't make the corner. Once it got inside the door, it wouldn't make the corner of the airplane. So a part of the airplane entrance was actually sawed off so that the coffin could make the corner once it was inside the airplane. Once it got inside the aircraft, which took considerable effort, Mrs. Kennedy chose to sit with the coffin of her deceased husband. And Flight Steward John Ames was later quoted as saying about that, he said, "On the way back to Washington, the only thing Mrs. Kennedy requested was a glass of water. She refused to change her blood-stained clothes. She wanted everybody to see the blood on her clothes and realize what happened to her husband in Dallas." Well, once inside the aircraft, Kenneth O'Donnell insisted that the plane leave immediately. He was all over it. And O'Donnell was convinced that the Dallas police would be pulling up at any time to try to take the president's body off the plane, because they had actually removed that body illegally. Well, O'Donnell then told General Godfrey McHugh, who was a military aide to President Kennedy, to get the damn plane in the air. And McHugh went to pilot James Swindle and asked why the plane had not taken off. And Swindle informed General McHugh that he had received orders not to take off. Well, Associate Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff informed the pilot that something was going on and to keep Air Force One on the ground. Now remember, Malcolm Kilduff was one that announced the president's death to the press. Well, General McHugh, hearing that, went directly to Malcolm Kilduff and said, "Why is this plane not taking off?" And General McHugh was told that Vice President Johnson was waiting to take the oath of office on the airplane. And McHugh didn't even realize Johnson was on the plane. They had assumed he would fly back to Washington, D.C. separate, because remember, he flew there on his own prior to the Texas trip. They didn't even know he was on the airplane. They were just trying to get going.
No, there are two 707s there because there's more than one Air Force One. Would there be 2 of those aircraft there at that time?
Well, Air Force One's simply the airplane
That's
the
the
president's on.
designation.
Yeah, but Johnson had his own plane there, and they thought he was, I don't know if it was there,
Yeah.
but they thought he was.
I was just wondering if it was also a 707.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Well, as a result, General McHugh then informs Malcolm Kilduff that Lyndon Johnson is not on the airplane. He says, "Lyndon Johnson's not on this airplane." And Kilduff turns to McHugh and said, "Well, you go tell that 6'4" Texan back there that he's not Lyndon Johnson," because he was on the airplane. Well, General McHugh points to the coffin, because it got kind of dicey, in the back of the plane and states, "My president is back there in that box." Well, this is just one example of how tough it would be for many of the Kennedy forces to transfer their loyalties to the new president, because they just weren't going to do that. Well, here's kind of an interesting controversy. There was no doubt that Lyndon Johnson wanted to be sworn in as president before Air Force One departed back for Washington, D.C. No doubt. And he wanted Bobby's permission to take the oath of office, because he was kind of stepping on toes. It's a controversial, emotional time. When do you say, hey, I want to be sworn in? When you got all these Kennedy supporters on the airplane that don't even want to acknowledge that this guy is going to be the next president, right?
Bobby and Lyndon Johnson
Did not get along at all.
Did not like each other.
No. Well, basically what happens is Vice President Johnson calls back to Washington and he asks Bobby what the constitutional requirements were concerning the oath of office and who could administer such an oath. Well, Bobby Kennedy told Vice President Johnson he'd check on it and get back to him in a few minutes. Well, historians note that Vice President Johnson wanted the decision to be whose? To be sworn in. Not his, Bobby's. Okay? And he even stated to Kennedy personnel on the aircraft prior to Bobby calling him back, Bobby wants me to take the oath in Dallas. Well, later on, Robert Kennedy insisted it was Johnson's idea for the Vice President to take the oath of office while in Dallas. Well, when all this was later found out, you can imagine the Kennedy supporters were pretty upset. Well, after receiving Bobby's blessing, I guess, Lyndon Johnson called a fellow by the name of Irving Goldberg. And Goldberg was a personal friend and a political advisor to the Vice President. And Johnson asked Irving Goldberg who could officially swear him in as president. Goldberg, not knowing the answer, then called U.S. Attorney Barefoot Sanders to get that information for the Vice President. Sanders gets the information. He informs Irving Goldberg that a federal judge could legally administer the oath of office. When Goldberg relayed that information back to Johnson, Vice President Johnson told Goldberg, you go find a federal judge so we can get this done. Well, Goldberg then called federal judge Sarah T. Hughes at her home and asked her to come out to Love Field. After the arrangements were made, the Vice President and Mrs. Johnson went to Mrs. Kennedy's cabin in the airplane to express their sorrow. First time they really had a chance to visit with her. Well, according to Mrs. Johnson, Jackie's dress was stained with blood along with her right glove as well, and Mrs. Johnson suggested to Mrs. Kennedy that she might want to clean up a bit prior to the swearing in of Vice President Johnson. And I don't think she did it in a mean way. I think she was trying to help her. And Jackie simply refused, stating, I want them to see what they've done to Jack. That was her comment. Well, soon afterwards, Judge Hughes arrives aboard Air Force One, and at 2:38 p.m., Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. And the famous photograph, which you have in front of you, of Johnson being administered the oath of office was taken by Cecil Stoughton, who was the White House photographer. And Stoughton had been chosen by the President and Mrs. Kennedy to photograph events of the White House. Now Stoughton was the first official White House photographer, a position that has since become standard for presidents. It wasn't before. Well, let's look and see who's in the picture. Some of you can see pretty good and some of you can't. Number one, you can find him on your picture there.
Is this still the same day?
Yes. Can you imagine? All this we've talked about is the same day.
This is only like 2 hours.
Yeah. For number one in your picture is Malcolm Kilduff. And he made the only audio recording of the event, and you can see he's holding up a dictabelt or dictaphone which had been on the President's desk on Air Force One. And you can kind of see him holding that microphone up to number two, Sarah T. Hughes' mouth, who was the federal judge who swore in the Vice President. Number three in the picture is Jack Valenti. He served as a liaison with the news media during the President's trip to Dallas. He later would become a very close special assistant to President Johnson during his term in office. Now, number four, you know who that fellow is? Albert Thomas. Ring a bell? Houston? Would have the largest payload.
Oh.
He was the congressman that Kennedy spoke in favor of in Houston that night when he made that error. That's Albert Thomas. Number five is Marie Femmer. She was a personal secretary to Vice President Johnson. Number six is Lady Bird Johnson. Number seven is Lyndon Baines Johnson. And number eight is Jackie Kennedy. Number nine is Homer Thornberry. He was a former congressman from Texas. He was appointed by President Kennedy to a seat on the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas in 1963. And number 10, she's kind of hard to see there. You can just kind of barely see her glasses there. That is Evelyn Lincoln, President Kennedy's personal secretary. Number 11, kind of interesting. You can see him back there a little bit. It's kind of hard to see, but you can just see kind of the top of his head. That was Roy Kellerman, the Secret Service agent in charge of the Dallas detail. Number 12 is Lem Johns. He was a Secret Service agent assigned to Vice President Johnson. Number 13 was Pamela Tunyer. Can you see her on here? Very good, 13. You can't see her very good. It's not a very good picture. I'll have to dig out the other one and pass it around. But Pamela was a former personal assistant to Jackie Kennedy, who was rumored to have had an affair with the president, just so you know. 14 is Jack Brooks. He was a congressman from Texas who served 42 years in the House. He was in the motorcade during the assassination. Number 15 is Bill Moyers, a journalist and public commentator who served as White House press secretary from 65 to 67 during the Johnson administration. He was appointed as Associate Director of Public Affairs for the newly created Peace Corps in 1961. And the 16, you can see him pretty good. Anybody want to guess who 16 is? You can see his eye. That's Jesse Curry, Chief of Police of Dallas, who was driving the lead car in the presidential motorcade in Dallas. That is a very, very famous picture. I'm going to grab the real deal here so you can see it better out of this book here. I think you'd like to maybe see it there. You can kind of pass it around and match it up to the one you have. Well,